Welcome to Trekosophy, the podcast devoted to Star Trek and philosophy. Recording this on July the 10th, the 2013 year of our Lord. I would like to introduce our host for this evening. First, Benjamin Sisko McLean. He does not hear the songs of angry men, and he did not leave the best behind.
And I can insert some kind of witty remark here which suggests that I've read or seen or listened to Less Miserable when I totally haven't.
Knock yourself out, Home Slice. And also Chris McGee, who spent 20 years chasing after a guy for having a low quality microphone.
He just wouldn't upgrade to a really high quality one.
And he was a miserablest person because of it. Tonight, if you haven't guessed it, we are discussing the Maquis or the Maquis.
Yeah, and how do you tell the difference between a terrorist and a revolutionary? And some other questions about war and peace that the Maquis storyline raises. First, I might ask us, anyone who might know, get on Memory Alpha, because we're going to need Memory Alpha for this one. Why would they name themselves the Maquis? Because as I understand it, Maquis would have suggested in the French Revolution, it would have suggested an affiliation with the old order of nobility. I mean, Maquis was a title of nobility, wasn't it? And so what are they doing naming themselves after the nobles? I could be completely wrong on that, but that sort of rings a bell.
Were they not the French Resistance?
Is that what the French Resistance called itself in World War II?
That was my understanding.
Oh, I did not know that about the French Resistance. In fact, I have not heard much about the French Resistance. I mean, how much of it was there?
Well, you have the Vichy regime, who had pretty much said, okay, well, you're now under Nazi control. And the parallel was the Federation, were the Vichy, who were unwilling to fight the Nazi aggressors. So you're now under Cardassian control. Get over it.
Oh, I see. All right, well, that makes some sense.
Yeah, a quick Google search brings up the Maquis in World War II as the rural guerrilla bands of French resistance fighters.
Ah, so it's much more recent history than the French Revolution. All right. Well,
it's not we ought Maquis for the same reason it's not Les Miserables.
I did say Maquis, didn't I? Without an S?
Yes, you did.
You did. I know that. No. I wasn't correcting your pronunciation, but I was saying it's a French name.
Oh, good.
That's what I was getting at. It's a French name.
All right. So, the no French jokes are necessary here. So. The background of the formation of the Maquis in Star Trek Deep Space Nine is that the Federation has just signed a treaty with the Cardassian Empire, which draws an arbitrary line in space and says that all territory on this side of the line is Federation territory and all territory on that side of the line is Cardassian territory. The trouble is, there are some planets on the Cardassian side of that line which were settled by Federation citizens. And there are planets on the Federation side of the line which are settled by Cardassian citizens.
Which we never see or hear about, really, but we assume that there are.
Yeah.
Well, there's the demilitarized zone.
Yeah.
Which quickly became militarized.
Yeah, the demilitarized zone is an area surrounding this line in which some of these planets exist. Now, the argument that the Maquis makes, and in all honesty, you have to admit that it is a pretty darn good argument, and that is that the bureaucrats and pencil pushers back on Earth who drew up this treaty with the Cardassian pencil pushers over subspace have no idea what it's really like out there on the frontier, and that they are making the lefty touchy-feely good multiculturalist assumption that the Cardassian government is basically equivalent to the Federation government and treats its colonies or any territory under its control in a fundamentally equivalent way. When in fact the Maquis argue this is not true. The Federation is committed to protecting. I'm making the Maquis argument here. We can knock it down later. The Federation is committed to protecting the Cardassians who live in Federation space, while the Cardassians are not at all committed to protecting the former Federation citizens who live in Cardassian space. And in fact, lots of raids go on. And the Cardassian government denies that there's a problem. And in fact, what they're trying to do, the Maquis argue, is drive the Federation citizens out of their homes. And so the Maquis take up arms, they argue, to protect their homes against these raids, at least in the beginning. Anyway,
I don't get the impression that that was necessarily the Maquis position. I mean, what they were asked to do was relocate, and they refused to relocate.
Oh, wasn't that later though?
Well, I was thinking in I can't remember what the episode was. It was where Wesley became a traveler.
Yeah,
I thought it was in an earlier episode that they weren't asked to relocate right away.
End. But I thought it was.
Right. They were asked to accept.
Correct this.
They were asked to accept Cardassian rule or relocate, if I remember correctly. Weren't they given a choice?
Yeah, and the smart thing would be to relocate, unless you're a real moron. But some of them choose to be morons. I mean,
well, hold on though. I mean, okay. Well, sorry. I need to let you. I'm sorry. I need to shut up.
No. Go ahead.
Well, there's one thing I want to say here real quickly, and I'd like to ask, who asked the citizens that eventually became the Maquis to leave those planets? Was it the Federation, or did the Cardassians demand that they leave? And of course, obviously, they didn't, because they had, created their own community there and their own village, and they did with their own bare hands, and they didn't want to leave it, and so forth. Who had asked them?
It was the Federation that had asked them to leave. I don't know that the Cardassians ever gave.
Okay.
Well, I was about to use a four-letter word there. I shan't. The Cardassians didn't give a shan't about who was on the planets, but that was the problem. The Cardassians didn't care. The Federation said, "You really need to relocate," and they were hard-hearted about the concept of relocation, and it was something to do with the spiritual tie of the land. And I come across sounding arrogant. Let's put ourselves in the Maquis position. Ben, you gave the Maquis argument. Let's bring it close to home here. I mean, what if, I think in my own mind, what if New Brunswick all of a sudden was, okay, well, now this is all of a sudden under Russian rule or native rule? Or what if that were to happen in Missouri or Kentucky, where they said this state now belongs to the First Nations, the natives who were originally here, because we need to have this peace? Well, you wouldn't be too happy about that. You'd probably be pretty ticked off.
Yeah.
And you might even be tempted to take up arms over it. And if your government didn't do anything to protect you, you'd say, well, forget that government.
Well, there's a huge temptation to do that.
Yeah. According to Memory Alpha here, it says that people who had worked all their lives to build these colonies were suddenly asked to either leave or stay behind under the rule of an uncertain and unscrupulous military power. And although the Cardassian government had officially pledged to leave the Federation colonists alone, a wide campaign of oppression began at practically the same time. Food replicators were poisoned, mobs were organized, and general harassment of the Federation colonists made life difficult at best.
Right, yeah. All of that was sort of unofficial persecution, which, So
In short,
persecution
you do
that
not want
doesn't count on paper, but happens in real life.
Right, exactly.
you don't
So
want
you
to
can
live under
sympathize
their
with them then.
assets. Well,
Sorry, what, Brandon?
not really. No, I don't have a whole lot, because if all of a sudden somebody said, due to strategic planning with the Commonwealth, Canada is now under Russian control. And suppose we were to say this back in the Cold War, I'd leave. I'm sitting in a, quite frankly, a beautiful spot of the world right now, no outdoors, but I'd leave. And I'd be upset about having to leave, but I wouldn't be so stubborn and dogmatic so as to stay and expect proper treatment from the Soviets when I know better. When you have advanced warning that these are not people looking out for your interests, how much sympathy is to be had?
Well, see, here in our society, we live in houses that are built by other people. We use products all day, every day, made by other people. And we take on jobs and roles that are largely constructed by other people.
And we also get our
ourselves.
food and drink from a store rather than growing it ourselves.
Right.
Okay.
But once you yourself have built your own home from the ground up, and somebody asks you to give up all of that, they're asking you a quite different thing than asking somebody in a modern urbanized society to move. They're asking something that is a rather bigger deal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I agree. We might be departing somewhat from track, though, if we're to pursue that.
Well, I think this is a big part of this is the argument the Maquis makes in the episodes. Now, I have some reasons I would bring against the Maquis, which no one's brought up yet.
Let's hear them.
I want us to first, though, understand the case that the Maquis
Yes,
made.
let's firmly establish the Maquis' position here. Now, well, and another thing to bring up too is that Kirby may disagree, but that's some people will agree with the Maquis, some people will disagree. Kirby's on the side of the people who disagree with him.
No. I probably would have joined them if I were.
Oh,
What? Seriously? Are you? Well, you've been saying everything like you disagree with them. Myself,
Well, that's because I think they're stupid. But, stupid people have rights too.
Well, I would disagree, I think, but it would be on a sort of the scale just barely tipped that way kind of disagree, I'd point out, I think a good standard of comparison we might use for the Maquis is the Alamo and the Mexican War of the United States versus Mexico. You'll recall that the Mexicans have for a long time believed that Texas should have been part of Mexico rather than part of the United States. And at one time, the Mexicans were claiming Texas as part of Mexico, or a large section of Texas. But they were American citizens who had been told by the American government, this is part of the United States, and if you form, communities here, they will be communities that are under the jurisdiction of the United States, who were being abandoned largely by the United States government, or so they thought, because the Mexicans were going to move, troops into that area and start building forts and so forth to assert the claim of Mexico to Texas. And so Santa Anna and his Mexican army are facing off against American settlers. And, of course, this is where the grand and glorious story of Davy Crockett ends. Of course, Davy Crockett heard there was a fight down there, and so he headed on down there because, when there's a fight, Davy Crockett is going to be heading towards it rather than away from it. So that analogy might be one that the Maquis might use, because a lot of people think that the siege of the Alamo was a sort of noble thing that the people inside the Alamo were trying to do, which was to keep their homes under the United States rather than Mexico. But the problem with that is, even though they felt largely abandoned by the United States government, the people inside the Alamo raised the American flag. I mean, they saw themselves as fighting for the United States, whether the United States government wanted them or not. You see, that's not quite what the Maquis are doing. The Maquis are forming their own government. I look at our American Revolution. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it goes into numerous reasons why our American Revolution was justified. That's what most of the Declaration is. It's a big, long list of gripes we have against the British, which we claim justify our revolution. One of the points that the Declaration makes, and I'm quoting this from memory, so it might be a little bit, it's going to be the gist of it, was that people are reluctant to people have the right to throw off governments whenever those governments work for the opposite of the ends for which they are instituted, right? Whenever a government is working against its proper aims, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. That's the claim the Declaration makes. And then it goes on to say that people are reluctant to alter forms of government that are long established, which they are accustomed to, for light and transient causes. So in order to actually have a revolution that is worth fighting, you have to have causes that are not light or transient, but are important enough to be worth fighting over. Now, some aspects of what the Maquis are fighting for in the beginning, I think, made some sense, because they were being abandoned by the Federation and given over to the Cardassians, which are this horrible, tyrannical police state type government, which, you know, is not what they signed up for. But at the same time, they're being asked to accept this police state government or leave their homes. That sounds like a good justification for a revolution to me. But they get dislocated from their homes and start living in these camps for months and months, in which their homes have been pretty much destroyed or taken over by Cardassians. And they continue fighting even though it's not realistic that they could ever actually defeat the whole Cardassian Empire. And they just continue fighting because they keep believing that somehow they're going to be able to regain those homes they lost, when they're not. See, in our American Revolution, we had the advantage that it was our country we were fighting over. And so that the only way the British could have won would be to send enough soldiers to physically occupy every square inch of the American continent, because as soon as the British soldiers left a town, that town fell back into American hands. The only territory which was controlled by the British was territory on which British soldiers were actually standing. That was not the case for the Maquis and their revolution. The Maquis lost their planet, and then that
the planet
planet is
the Cardassian
gone.
territory.
Well, those are criteria for just war. You have to have a hope of victory. It has to be a war that you could win.
Well, and a lot of revolutions end up kind of burning out like that. They start out with a noble cause, a justifiable cause, and the longer it gets drawn out, the less important that cause seems to be, or the cause seems to get lost in the shuffle. There was another episode of Next Gen, I believe, called I should have looked that up before I said anything.
Oh, I think I know. Well, it was in the original series, Let This Be Your Last Battlefield. You remember?
Yeah,
that fighting, was even though the issues were long gone.
It was the two halves of the monotone skin color.
Yeah,
the high ground. The high ground is another one. They mentioned that the and that's the one I was thinking of in the Next Generation. where the resistance fighters, I mean, they've been fighting so long, they practically forgot why they were fighting in the first place.
Yeah, the important point is to just let go of the hatred. That's how you have victory in that case. Well,
which brings up an interesting question, and I hate to, I'm sorry to have to interrupt you, Ben, but and maybe we can bring this up a little bit later, but brings up an interesting question. Is Gandhi's idea of resistance the better idea?
No, it isn't. It is if it is strategically applied. Because there were other cases in which it was applied and the people were entirely wiped out and genocide was the result. Mm-hmm. And in that case, it's stupid. And in the case of the Maquis, it was stupid. They shouldn't have done it, and they all died.
Yeah, they did.
There was no... You have to be reasonable and you have to be rational. And all of a sudden, they're wanting to go to a war, which is a brutal thing in and of itself, over... I don't want to trivialize it and say just dirt, but over something that's transient. It's not eternal. It's not ethics. It's not justice. It's their homes, and they were so attached. They were willing to give up their lives for their homes. I mean, if my house is on fire, I'm going to run out.
Yeah.
Because I'm not an idiot.
It's like in the instance of Command, same thing.
No, this is my home. I'm staying here. No, you're fighting an impossible army, and you're going to die. And what happened to them? You feel bad for their families, but if you're willing to die for your house, there's only so much sympathy to be had.
Exactly, I agree.
Well, hold on though. The Cardassians are rational moral agents. They're not a fire. I mean, you've reduced the Cardassians to being sort of a force of nature. I mean, a fire is not unjust in this because no one, unless an arsonist set it or something. But a fire is not a moral wrong. It's just it's just an unfortunate circumstance. But their claim, at least in the beginning, is that an injustice has been done to them and that their homes are being taken away. Now, as the war goes on, they completely lose sight of that, and they continue fighting just to kill Cardassians in the end. And so they go wrong. But I think a case could be made that the Maquis are reasonable in some of their aims in the beginning, although I think their means are quite often wrong.
Where I disagree with the Maquis is in their valuation. I mean, the reason why the treaty was drawn up was purely for strategic reasons. The Federation couldn't continue a war, the Cardassians couldn't continue a war, and so they drew a treaty that was in the best interests of both sides for the greater good. And some people said, well, go ahead.
Well, that's what the Federation would claim happened, but that's arguable.
Okay, well, that's just fan fiction at some point. In terms of the ethics...
No, I mean, different characters in the show would argue about whether that's what really happened. I mean, the Maquis characters certainly wouldn't characterize the treaty that way. So, I mean, there are two sides to that argument, is all I'm pointing out. I mean, that's not a common assumption between the two sides, that the treaty was actually mutually beneficial. I mean, the Cardassians would claim the treaty pretty much bamboozled the Federation, that it's a bad treaty. I mean, in fact, I believe it gets called a bad treaty by that guy, what's his name?
The
guy, Hudson says it's a bad treaty. He just outright says that. So, I mean, I'm just saying that they disagree about that issue.
Well, the Maquis did, because they're being asked to give up their homes.
Their what?
Their homes.
Right. They're losing their homes, yes.
My own view is that the Federation shouldn't have done the Cardassians' dirty work for them and gone on after the Maquis as terrorists.
Oh.
I think when it was arrived at, they should have said, okay, well, you accepted to have the Maquis under your jurisdiction. And when it comes down to Eddington versus Cisco, I really did think of Cisco as the Javert character and Eddington as the Jean Valjean type, who is just trying to help the oppressed underclass who don't have a hope of winning, who are going to get slaughtered. It's in Victor Hugo. It's in Gene Roddenberry. So I was actually on Eddington's side for all of that. I actually thought that was something admirable. But the Federation, it became something. I saw them as being puppets for the Cardassians in pursuing the Maquis. I'll put it like that.
Okay. Well, two things to say about that. One is, I think the Federation's continued involvement with pursuing and fighting against the Maquis was twofold. First, the Maquis were using Federation weapons and personnel who had defected, like Hudson and Eddington.
Right.
They defected from the Federation. That makes them guilty of treason, which is a pretty serious crime. Yes, it does. If you defect from if you're in the military and you defect, you don't resign, but you continue to use your position in the military to undermine your government for the sake of a foreign power, that makes you a traitor. And under the laws of nations, that makes you, the punishment for that's hanging.
Okay, well,
so that's a fairly serious crime.
I don't know if I agree with hanging, but I agree with you on that point.
Yeah, but
I was thinking of like a Cal Hudson sort of like, or Ro Laren, where they just say, you know what, forget this position.
If they resign first, and renounce their citizenship, and then go join the revolution wherever else, that's not treason. But if they attempt to use their position in the military, that's treason. So I'm just pointing that out. Also, it's the Federation's, technology, weapons, and so forth are being used by them, and the Cardassians can quite reasonably hold the Federation responsible for that in some ways. Because, if the Federation armed the Maquis, which is how the Cardassians would see it, that could be an act of war. And so that would violate the treaty. So the second reason is that the Maquis may be destroying the treaty, and on the assumption that the Federation is correct about the treaty, that it is mutually beneficial for both sides, the Federation has been put into a position where they pretty much have to go after the Maquis, or at least put a good show on of going after the Maquis to preserve the treaty. So, in some ways they're being Cardassian puppets, but in terms of the laws of nations, assuming interplanetary relations are based on the laws of nations here on Earth in some ways, they are in a position where they pretty much have to go after the Maquis in some ways.
Well, because they are Federation citizens. Now, obviously, they did find a solution to this in the Next Gen episode, Journey's End, where they basically said, look, if you're not going to give up your homes and you want to live under Cardassian rule, fine, but we're going to have to cut off help. You are no longer Federation citizens. You are completely on your own. And they said, fine, we'll be on our own.
And if you're the Cardassians, the Cardassian Union, which I draw as a parallel to the Soviet Union, the first thing you're going to do is wipe out your inhabitants. There could be Federation spies here. They could be harboring who knows what. They're dead. There's no reason to keep these people around.
Yeah,
and
pretty much.
The Maquis were quickly, like, I have so very little respect for that mentality. Now, Ben, you and I think, are on different sides of the coin here. I don't see where the Federation are coming from. And I get what you're saying in terms of self-interestedness.
Politically, I see where they're coming from. Morally, it's a different question.
They have to pretend that they don't like the Maquis, but Cisco really doesn't. He really did say, you know what? I've been betrayed. And
Yeah, he did.
I'm going to start poisoning people until they're poisoning planetary atmospheres until I get what I want.
Yeah, I don't agree with that at all. I don't agree with that at all. So, I mean, with what Cisco did. I'm not saying I disagree with you. I'm saying I disagree with what Cisco did.
Right.
Does that make, yeah.
Well, I know what you're saying. I don't know, like the Cardassians were clearly arming some of their citizens. I thought that was made clear in a couple of different episodes. In the Federation, weren't explicitly arming. They were, I mean, at best, being robbed from the Maquis.
Yeah.
Which I think is, we can have that discussion. But the point is, the Federation can claim innocence here, as far as I'm concerned. They're not actively doing it. There's some people defecting, and as they defect, they're raising Hades for the Cardassians. And I don't see what the point would be of. It would be like the Vichy regime going after the French resistance.
The what?
Vichy French, the Nazi puppet in France when they took over.
Oh, yeah.
Those are unlike scenarios, but to me, it's not couth. That's the word I'm looking for. It's not couth for the Federation to do that.
Okay. I mean, I can see it being justified as a political necessity to preserve the treaty, is all I was saying. If you assume that the treaty is worth preserving, which I'm not convinced of.
No, but there's an inequality here whereby the Cardassians arm their citizens, and now the Federation have to, just bend over and take it from the Cardassians.
Well, that's what makes it a bad treaty, according to the Maquis.
Well, according to the Federation practice.
I mean, you're making an argument against the treaty, which is pretty much the same argument the Maquis make.
As I say, if I were at that time, as stupid as I thought they were being, as honest to goodness, as ridiculous as their mentality. Well, for example, I'm not Jewish, but I thought, Hitler's shenanigans were uncalled for.
Hitler what?
Hitler's shenanigans were uncalled for.
Oh, well.
I'm not Jewish. I think I'm not a Maquis.
I mean, what
I think they were wronged.
Are we taking opposition to Hitler as a thing that was at any point in question?
No, I'm using that as setting precedent here for my example, or for my argument. For my example, that's my example.
I guess I might. Okay, well, I guess I might point out a parallel that is particularly relevant for me personally.
Okay.
As a Latter-day Saint, there was a point at which the Boggs administration officially made it the policy of the government of Missouri to kill all the Mormons and drive them out of Missouri.
Was it Mormon missionaries or was it actual Mormons?
Everybody, men, women, and children.
Every dirtbag wearing a tie and a name tag. They're out.
Yeah, pretty much.
Huh.
And this was, of course, in Joseph Smith Jr.'s time. This was long before anyone had ever even thought of Utah or the splits in the Mormon Church and so on. But
this is when you guys were still restored.
Okay. Well, anyway, there was at that time a lot of Latter-day Saints who wanted to fight the government. I mean, they were a fairly large contingent of that area. A lot of able-bodied men with guns who had homes that they had built up after having moved over and over to get there. And this is an unjust law. I mean, it's as unjust as you can get. I mean, whether you're a Latter-day Saint or not, surely Boggs' extermination order was an unjust law. There's people coming to kill us. Let's fight back. and let's, form our own government. Just forget the United States government. But Joseph Smith, whether you want to ascribe it to God or to Joseph Smith's own decision, he brings a revelation which basically says that the Constitution of the United States was established by God for the protection of all flesh, I believe it says. But the point is the people's liberties and so on, and that they should continue to petition the government to for a redress of these grievances and not to fight against the government. And in the wake of that, instead of fighting, they fled Missouri for Iowa and Ohio. And but it's been since then that there's never been a motion or movement against the United States government in the Latter-day Saint movement since that time because of that revelation. But the point was that they saw it as more important to preserve the liberties and so on that were established by our Constitution and than to overthrow this evil state government, because the Constitution is supposed to last a lot longer than this little state government in any event. I mean, it was looking at it a little bit more. It was looking at it a little bit more long term than the immediate issue, And I think that's something that the Maquis might be missing. That they're looking at, we're getting screwed over today, but they aren't looking at the Federation over the next 100, 200, 300, 400 years. They're looking at our little problem today, and that's all they're looking at, And
I think that's a great point.
Yeah,
I think that's it reminds me of the quotation that I'm sure you're well familiar with, that unjust law is no law at all.
That was Martin Luther King Jr., wasn't it?
Well, initially it was Augustine, and then the Aquinas solidified. Well, Martin Luther King Jr. was an Aquinian. You have to remember, he was a systematic theologian. If you're a systematic theologian, you go back to Aquinas. Aquinas defended that statement, and the basis on which he defended the statement was a law is to bring justice to the land. And if it's unjust, then it's not really a law. It's dictation. It's a dictate, but it's not a law. An unjust law is not a law. A circled square is not a square. It's nonsense. You're speaking meaningless nonsense at that point.
But there's a slight problem with that in that how do you decide when something's an unjust law? Does that give you a license to disobey the law whenever your opinion disagrees with it because you see it as unjust?
You'd have to hold up to some sort of standard.
Right.
Well, I might be inclined to think that the Federation were right in making the treaty, but wrong in pursuing the Maquis.
I agree with you there.
Because for strategic purposes, for utilitarian purposes, they might be inclined to say, you know what? I really don't want a war to keep going, which is going to kill millions and millions. Let's just draw a line in the sand and be done with it. Given that that was the right thing to do, the people who happen to be on the wrong side of the sand, you don't have to go and hunt them down. Yeah, I think we should empathize with them rather than treat them as is recalcitrant the word I'm looking for? What's the word I'm looking for? Help me out.
But here's the trouble. Of course,
rather than treating them as insubordinates. Insubordinates is the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, well, the trouble is the Maquis actually were starting to actually engage in some questionable tactics, blowing up shuttles and so on, and that's a problem, I mean, some of that stuff you might not have been able to get along with the Maquis as long as they're doing some of that stuff. But assuming they weren't, then yeah.
Well, it's the Federation. You have to remember the Rolaren episode where she defected. Why did she defect? Because the Federation were trying to set them up.
That's right.
The Federation decided to be the belligerent ones and go after them. There's no need for that. It was uncalled for. The Maquis wanted to leave them alone. Then the Federation said, no, we're going to hunt you down. And Rose said, you know what? No, you're not. You're not going to be able to do that. And kudos to her.
So you agree with Rolaren?
I do.
Yeah. Well, there's something in the Old Testament called the Sword of Justice, if I recall correctly, and it's basically it's a principle of when when people are permitted to kill under the old Mosaic law, if I recall correctly, and it's basically that there are several conditions under which you have the sword of justice on your side and you're justified in taking up the sword. And you have to have been wronged. The person has, the other party has to, not be surrendering, but continuing to wrong you. And the Lord has to deliver them into your hands. And that's a part of it which a lot of people ignore, because that's the reason I would disagree with Scott Roeder assassinating George Tiller, because it's very clear that the Lord did not deliver George Tiller into Scott Roeder's hands. Scott Roeder had to go find George Tiller.
Is that an abortion thing?
Yeah, it was an assassination of an abortion doctor. He had to plot and scheme and so on. Basically force his own way. And so there's a problem, our American Revolution basically had the British put into our hands in a lot of ways because of that whole situation.
Yeah, you better watch it.
I described the whole situation of how the British only occupied the territory that they actually stood on. It was impossible from the moment the American people decided they wanted independence. It was impossible for the British to win because the British would only control the territory they're actually standing on. So that might be not a full, complete philosophical justification for revolution, but it might be a hint in the direction of developing one. Even if you don't believe in God, some sort of principle along those lines that you have to have some reasonable expectation of winning without compromise, without significant compromise anyway, in order to actually have a revolution be justified. And I don't have my thoughts fully developed on this. I mean, this is kind of speculating, but those are just some thoughts on the question of revolution and the Maquis. I may have a more fully developed doctrine of when revolutions are justifiable in a few years. I really need to go and listen to all the speeches and writings and so on of Martin Luther King Jr. Because he seems to know a lot about this stuff. I might not always agree, but I wouldn't want to write about it without having read what he has to say in more detail first.
Well, the book that I found absolutely groundbreaking was From Strength to Love by Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote, and Chris, feel free to edit this out, but I just, on a personal note, From Strength to Love met me where I was at. I tend to be a pacifist. Politically, not so much, but personally, I tend to be a bit of a pacifist. And what he was talking about in terms of the Hegelian synthesis of being as wise as serpents, just being absolutely devastating in our critical thinking, but as peaceful as lambs when it comes to whether or not we ought to be when it comes to the heart, you have to be loving, you have to be peaceful, and you have to be ingratiating. But when it comes to the mind, you actually have to be extremely critical. in the synthesis that he forged between truth and beauty came to define my own thinking. So I have such a huge soft spot for him. He's rhetorically eloquent, but philosophically rigorous. And I've always had a huge soft spot for his views on pacifism and revolutions. When to be a revolutionary, when to be critical, when to be vociferous, when to be belligerent, when to be recalcitrant.
Yeah.
When to be insubordinate, and when to be loving. That synthesis to me defines not just my philosophy, but my own personal life. And to apply that on the political realm, I thought that was wonderful.
I would not describe myself as a pacifist. In fact, I would describe myself as a militarist in some contexts. But for settling the kinds of issues that Martin Luther King Jr. set out to settle, I think he had a lot of the right ideas. And they were based in the natural law ethics that our American system is supposed to be based in. And so even though I wouldn't call myself a pacifist, I would say that I would acknowledge a great deal of influence and inspiration from a great many great pacifists, including Martin Luther King Jr.
Thanks for listening to the podcast, and don't forget to check us out on the website, Trekosophy.com, or on Facebook, Trekosophy the group, or on Twitter, or email us, trekosophy@gmail.com, or on iTunes. By all means, move heaven and earth if you have to. Leave us a review. Feel free to ask us your questions. Don't forget to donate on the website, or join us next week. If you think Ben, Chris, and I are just out to lunch, you-know-what crazy, join us next week and let us know. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Have yourselves a wonderful day.
Yeah, and don't poison entire planets. Duh.
Don't. Yeah, let's wise up. Don't be up to just absolutely greasy shenanigans and poison.
Let me hit play on this intro thing you're talking about real quick.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Except my computer is crashing. Oh.
Computer's always crashing.
I'm back. Oh wait, you guys can still hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I hope I didn't fart too loudly. Having a gay old time, really. That's what I'm doing. What are you guys doing? Better be gay.
Les Miserables. I can never pronounce it.
Don't forget to check us out on the website, Trekosophy.com, or on Facebook, Trekosophy the group, or on Twitter, hashtag, I don't tweet. Shoot.
Just at Trekosophy.
Leave that in. Leave this in, too. Leave my meta-narrative in.
It'll take probably some good editing from Chris to actually piece the two versions together and get it right.
I can do this in my sleep.
Wait, can I redo my intro? I thought my intro sucked. Can I redo that?
I haven't seen Les Miserables. Les Miserables.
Well, do I get a final thought? Wait, no, I don't have a final thought.
You don't?
Hitler's shenanigans were uncalled for. That's my final thought.
Pirates in Zone?
You guys don't get lame Miz jokes, do you?
Let's spin the wheel of topics.
What did I do here? I don't even remember.
Something related to Les Miserables.
I probably... Do you guys speak Spanish? Let me write down some thoughts that I could just throw in here.
Alright.
Wow, that's some serious writing down there.
I was expecting Kant and